Hi, I'm Wendy Wasserman. I'm from Politics and Prose. The reason I'm on a mic as opposed to just speaking is because we are also broadcasting this live on YouTube. So hopefully your mics work too, so we can...
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. So our YouTube friends can hear us. And when we get to the Q&A, we're actually going to pass around this mic for that same reason. As I said, I'm Wendy Wasserman from Politics and Prose. I'm the community sales manager. One of the things we do at Politics and Prose is we develop private author events for businesses. So if someone like Leila was available to go to your business and you wanted to hear her talk, you would call us and we would make it happen. It's kind of amazing that way. You didn't know that, did you?
No.
So we're really, really thrilled to be here with Leila and with Kristin. Before we get started, just a few little housekeeping announcements. This is the time where you turn off your phones. Everyone's done that. Okay, I probably haven't turned mine off, but that's okay. After the event, we're going to ask your help in folding up the chairs, but we don't want them folded up over there because we are going to do a signing line. Both Leila and Kristin will be available to sign books. We have tons of both of them, so buy the book for your friend and your neighbor's friend and your friend's neighbor and all that kind of stuff. Okay, I think those are my announcements. I'm actually kind of fangirling Leila. I read the book about 2 months ago, and I have not stopped thinking about it. And I have a 19-year-old daughter, so I'm kind of in awe. So I just want to tell you a few other people who are fangirling her. The New York Times said that Mottley writes with a lyrical abandon that reminds us she was once Oakland's Youth Poet Laureate. She's also getting around the world. The Sydney Morning Herald said Mottley captures the rhythm of speech, the code switching of the Oakland streets, the unique language of children and teens, and of slick lawyers and slimy cops with virtuosic talent. So, but then there's also one person who said it all. It brings me great joy to introduce readers to new authors. And this young poet, Leila Mottley, wrote a soul-searching portrait of survival and hope. You know who that is. That was actually from Oprah, who announced Leila's book as the Oprah Book Club of the Month, which is a big, big deal. So yay!
Thank you.
If you haven't, there's actually a really cute video, like you're probably tired of hearing about this, but there's a really cute video where Oprah tells her, and it's like the most charming thing in the world. So let's talk a little bit about Leila. Leila is the 2018 Oakland Youth Poet Laureate, for real. Her work has been featured in the New York Times and Oprah Daily. There's a theme here. She was born and raised in Oakland, where she continues to live. Nightcrawling is her first published novel. There are 2 other novels that she has written and are now under lock and key, and no one will ever read them. But there's another one coming, I think, right?
Yes,
Ooh.
eventually.
Okay, Leila will be in conversation with Kristin Henning, yay, a national recognized trainer and consultant on the intersection of race, adolescence, and policing. Kristin is the Blume Professor of Law and director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic, an initiative at the Georgetown Law Center. She was the lead attorney of the Juvenile Unit of the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia and has launched a number of initiatives to challenge racial injustice in the courts. She's also the author of Right There, Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth. Like I said, we have a ton of those too. She'll sign them for you, which was released just last September, so you're not too late. And it was also featured on the cover of the New York Times Book Review, so they liked it too. The book weaves together stories of Black children arrested and prosecuted in juvenile and criminal court. So that's enough from me. Kristin, Leila?
Take it away.
Go for it.
Yes, I'm so excited to be here. So first of all, I'm going to ask the first question that I know everybody wants to know. You are like a superstar overnight. So everybody wants to know, for people who didn't see that video where Oprah appears and says, "Hi, I'm Oprah, and I've selected your book." So I think what we all want to know is, how did it feel to be selected by Oprah, and how does this week, this whirlwind week, feel like?
I mean, I think I blacked out when she popped up on my Zoom screen. There's really no way to process it, and at the same time, when you see Oprah Winfrey, you know it's her. And she sang to me. She sang congratulations in her Oprah voice, and it was the highlight of my life. So I've known for about 5 months, which gave me some time to really internalize it, and then it came out, and it has not stopped since.
So I only found out like 3 days ago, and I'm like, how did they get the O there so fast?
That's what I have been wondering that for years. I didn't know how they did it. It's a very intricate process. They know what's up, yeah.
They clearly know what's up, and they forced you to keep a secret. So
yeah.
Did you tell your parents?
No. They made me sign an NDA. What? I didn't tell any. Yeah.
Not even your parents?
No, not even my parents.
Okay. I'm actually just fascinated by that process. All right. Well, you have achieved every writer's dream. So then I really want to understand, so you started writing this book, if I'm not correct, or finished writing it at 17 or started at 17?
Finished at 17.
Finished at the age of 17. The question becomes, how do you become a novelist by the age of 17 and a poet laureate by the age of 17? So the first thing that comes to my mind is, who are your people? Like, who is your family? Can you tell us a little bit more, even than Wendy told us, about your background and your family and how you grew to love writing?
I mean, how do you become a novelist at 17? You write a novel. I think that more for me, like I wrote my first novel at 14, and my second at 15, and my third, which is this one, I started at 16 and finished at 17. And so I've been writing since I learned how to, and I think it's just always been just in my nature. I don't know if I could really pinpoint how or why. My dad is a writer. He's always had a day job, and then he's always written at night. But he writes plays and screenplays, which is kind of a whole different ballpark. And so he wasn't much help. I don't even think I've read anything that he wrote until, maybe a year ago. So we don't exchange work. He didn't read anything of mine. I didn't read anything of his. We didn't write together, sit down and do that. But I think that just having someone who pursued this outside of a school context definitely gave me the understanding that writing was about more than just like an accomplishment, like a task, and that writing was something you could do for pleasure and for fun and because you had a story to tell. And so I think that definitely influenced me. And then my mom's a reader. She likes books. And so I think that I had access to books. I had a bookshelf in our apartment growing up, and I, had books that reflected me too. And I think that definitely made a difference in me knowing that like I could write a book that I would want to read because I had read books that I would want to write.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. I love it. So she talks about wanting to write a book, not as a task, yet you made a career out of it. Like, that's really phenomenal.
That wasn't my intention.
It was or was not?
It was not my intention. No.
Following your love and your passion.
Yeah.
That's excellent.
Yeah.
And then, so I'm fascinated also by this transition from short form poetry and even spoken word into this novel.
Yeah.
We'll talk about your lyrical style. But how is that transition? Is it similar or different for you?
Well, I've been writing poetry for as long as I've been writing fiction. One's just been more public. So I became the poet laureate when I was, I think, right before I turned 16. And so I spent a year during my 16th year performing all the time around the Bay Area. And I think it was really interesting for me because I wasn't initially a spoken word poet. I wrote very much like on the page poetry, and then this opportunity to apply to the program came up, and I said, okay, well, I think I could probably figure out how to do this. And so I taught myself how to write spoken word poetry. and it's not the thing that comes most naturally to me. But I also like to try new styles of writing, and so then I became the Poet Laureate, and people would ask me to write like certain poems about certain things, and I'd have to like learn how to do it for another person. And I think that's what made me go back to novel writing, is that like it was just for me, and no one saw it for over a year after I wrote it, until I think the agent offers were like the first real time I let someone read it.
To read it. Oh, that's excellent. I love it. I love it. I love it. So tell us, let's jump into Nightcrawling, because I think that's such a fascinating book. But I want to start, since we're talking about you, I want to start with Oakland for a moment, right? So you're the Poet Laureate of Oakland. When I read the book, all right, y'all should note, I'm just telling you, notes, whatnot, in the back. One of the notes.
That's so cool.
I took a lot of notes, y'all. So one of the things that I wrote to myself, when I finished reading the book, I wrote a note that I said, it's one thing to set your story in a place that like Oakland, a city that and that you're familiar with, but there seemed to be something so much more, a deep love of the city, is what that was just a personal takeaway in reading it. And then I was looking at, videos of you online, and you like have this poem that says, Dear Oakland, and it just affirmed for me how much you love Oakland. Can you just say a word about, Oakland for you, what it means to you, and why it's so important for the book, and then we'll go in there.
Yeah, no, I love Oakland, and I was born and raised in Oakland. I still live in Oakland. I don't intend on ever leaving Oakland.
She's coming to see
I
gave her my card, told her she can come stay.
It's true. But I think that part of it is that I didn't see Oakland reflected back to me in a way that I understood growing up. And so I think the representations of Oakland in the media are often very binary. They tend towards this thing that happens to a lot of historically black cities where, they're violent and they're crime-ridden, don't go there, is one representation. And then in the face of, the influx of wealth and mass displacement that happened, 2012 and on, this idea of it as like a new city, like an up-and-coming place that you should move to. I felt very like angry at both of those, and just couldn't see my version of Oakland in the representations in literature or beyond. And so I wanted to write it, and to write it with all of the nuance in the world that allowed this city in its essence, its vibrance, to come through on the page. Because I think that we deserve to have representations of our homes that reflect us, because that is how we, create the fabric of our country, and how we all see our world.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. And I think your word nuance is so perfect. Like, I felt like there were times where you were very honest about the problems, the challenges of Oakland, but at the same time, I could see the beauty. I could see that you love this city. And so,
there's both.
Yeah.
There's always both.
I love it. I love it. Well, so your book is set in Oakland and originates or grounded in this real live police scandal.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I wanted to know was, how old were you when that scandal broke, and how much of it, like, were you processing at that age while it was happening, as opposed to later on reflection?
I think I was like about 14.
14, wow.
Yeah, and I think, that's like the age that a lot of us become very aware of our world and our surroundings and our place in it. And I think it had a big impact on my idea of myself, because it was a reflection of the things I already knew walking through the world in my body. And I think that often there isn't a representation of like young girlhood, and particularly, what girls of color experience and our like vulnerability literally walking down the street.
Yeah.
And so I paid a lot of attention to the case, and it's really interesting now, because I talk about it and I hear that no one outside of the Bay has like ever heard of the case. And it entirely consumed our media for months. And I remember paying attention to the way the media spoke about it too, because there was this really disproportionate focus on the trust between the police department and the community, and how this was just going to ruin the trust, which as though it hadn't been ruined in the first place, as though it was ever there. And so I think that I paid a lot of attention to not only that, but the neglect of any attention to what does it mean? What does this harm do to young girls? And what about the thousands of other girls and women who experience this, and their stories are just never at that heightened level of visibility.
So we're having this inside ball conversation, and I realized I should ask you a setup question, which was give people the synopsis. So for folks who haven't read, what was that scandal, so that people know the base, and then we could pick back up.
So in 2016, a case broke in the Bay Area where a young girl, she went by the alias Celeste Guap. She was sexually abused by a network of Bay Area police officers, and there were attempts to cover this up. And when the investigation came out, there was this really rapid police chief turnover. I think 3 police chiefs in 9 days, some absolutely insane turnover, and it's rocked kind of the foundation of the police department for a very short period of time, and then it faded away. There were minimal repercussions, and the whole world moves on.
The whole world moved on, and you're so right about people not knowing about it. And I think this is significant because my life's work is around, the intersections between race, adolescence, and policing, and I didn't know the story until I read Nightcrawling.
No one knows about it.
It's really wild.
And that's also true for the few other cases that have made it to the media throughout the past 3 decades. No one has heard. Yeah.
And what's so interesting, so this, I just want to skip ahead because when I was reading, I make it a habit, I don't want to know much about the book. Josie from, Penguin Random House reached out and said, you've got to, meet this fabulous woman. I'm sure, this sounds wonderful. So I started reading the book, and I am did this really happen? And it's fiction. And I know it's fiction. I know it's a novel, but I'm did it really happen? And you know what we do? We Google. We're something had to happen. And sure enough. And so, so that's one of the things that I want to say to you is that as someone who does this work and who actually tells stories about clients, my own young people that I represent, your story read so real. It read like one of the young people. Oh my God. So I was so moved by that. And I wanted to say thank you for sort of sharing this story, because you can use fiction to share the same, sort of narrative. And so it was an opportunity for you to elevate those voices, and I really, really appreciate it. I have to say, one of the things, I'm gonna see if I can remember, it's in my notes, but you talk about, maybe it was in the author's note or maybe in an interview that I saw, about how Black girls are invisible, how you're trying to create an opportunity for Black girls to be heard. And the most powerful statement that you made about it, you were talking about, it's in the book, it's actually in the novel itself. You talk about how there was a protest, right? People were, was it a Black Lives Matter or a protest?
Yeah, Black Lives Matter protests. I went to a lot of them in 2015, and then again in 2020 after I had written the book, and the same thing happened at both.
Where your question was, here they are, I think they were protesting Freddie Gray. Here they are protesting police brutality and Freddie Gray, and the question you asked to the characters are, but will they say anything about the sexual exploitation of the girls by the police? It wasn't going to be a part of it. No. And it's so true, Leila. I thought that was fascinating how when we have these conversations about police violence right now and police corruption, it's not about sex trafficking.
Never.
It's not.
No.
And so, it was fascinating. So tell us about Kiara. Tell us, who she is, right? Who she was to you. How did you evolve Kiara in your mind from this real life story?
I mean, I from the beginning knew that I was not writing about the girl from the 2016 case, that it had to be an entire, this character had to be her own in order for us to enter her mind and exist with her through all of this. We don't get to know real people's minds in that way, and I think that especially with teenage Black girls, most people don't even care about our internal worlds or believe that there is anything happening inside of our heads. And so I wanted to create this story that really is in entire narrative control of this girl who has been told her whole life that she's supposed to care for everyone around her, and how that pattern and that socialization has raised her to enter this kind of system in which she is again exploited and used, and never given the opportunity to recognize her own vulnerability.
Wow. So how do you tell us a little bit more about the writing process? How do you develop a character like that? What's your process for developing her?
I immerse myself entirely. So I think when I wrote this book, I started with Kiara. The first sentence is still the first sentence I ever wrote, still the first sentence in the book.
Read it for us, please.
All right. The swimming pool is filled with dog shit, and Dee's laughter mocks us at dawn.
Wow.
And I had that from the very beginning, and it kind of started this idea of okay, who is this character? How does she see the world around her? And then from there, I started journaling from her perspective. I draft really quickly, so the full first draft is I think 2.5 months. For me to write it, and that was because I was writing every single day, so often that there was no leaving her, and because I couldn't leave her, it meant I had to experience the world with her, and I think that actually helped me a lot because some people say that this is like a dark book, and there's some truth to that, but Kiara doesn't experience her world as one full of, only pain or heartache, and because she doesn't experience herself that way, it meant that I didn't have to experience herself and her story that way, which made it bearable to get through the writing process in such a rapid fashion.
Yeah, and because a rapid fashion, and then the trauma of writing it. Right?
It was hard.
Yes.
It was hard at times. But then there are also these moments throughout the book that I made sure, she has a wide spectrum of experiences that are not only limited to the moments of pain and abuse.
That's right.
And I think for me, it was really important that she want more, and that she experience more, because as humans, there's no way for us to exist if we only experience one thing, and we experience more than one thing in one moment. And so I wanted the book to do that too, to allow us to experience more than just what we might expect from her story.
And you did that beautifully. I mean, we experienced love, we experienced laughter, we experienced the caretaking that you talked about. I also wondered whether there was a little piece of you, her absolute love for the arts, right? So your form of art is here in the writing, but she loved painting, and her brother Marcus loved music. And I was like, ooh, this is definitely got some.
I also went to an arts high school, and so that meant that I was surrounded by young kids doing art, and I think that definitely had an impact on the way that I saw young people. But also, I think that for me, it was really important that we think about how even Kiara with her art, the thing that brings her joy. Right. Is also made into a commodity to be consumed by others. And so I think that it was important for me to recognize how even in the one thing that brings her relief, she is again placed in a position in which she is, something from her is wanted by someone else, and it is not her choice.
That's right. Ooh, I'm going to come back to choice. I have a lot of thoughts about choice, but we'll come back to that. On this notion of creating this, right? So I'm always fascinated by novels that are rooted in real fact. And particularly, so I'm a lawyer talking to you, and I'm sitting there reading, how does she know this about the grand jury? Where did she, so what was that process like?
God. Yeah.
How did you, I'm thinking Law and Order, do they have a consultant? How did you get this right?
No, I didn't have a consultant for that one. That one was just research. Okay. I love research, so it was really, fun for me to get to go through all of the logistics. Sometimes it was hard to have to balance the story with it, especially with the grand jury. Right. There are so many rules, so many rules, and I had to kind of weave around them in order to tell the story in the way that I knew it had to be told, but not make it inauthentic to the actual legal parameters. So I did a lot of research for the book in different ways, and I enjoy it, so it's okay.
That's great. Yeah. I was impressed. I definitely was wondering. And how much of the story sticks to the the facts that you were able to read about of the case, the police scandal?
Some of it, but most of it not.
Most of it not, okay.
Yeah, I think that for me, I just I didn't use it as like a guideline.
Got it.
If it felt like, oh, there's some symmetry, that makes sense in order to explore this thing, then I would borrow elements. But for the most part, it was about telling the story in the way it needed to be told, and that doesn't always include the fact of real life.
Real life. Oh, that's great. So let's hit this theme choice. Because for me, I'm telling you, I take a lot of notes, all right? I have an entire page of every time I felt like the issue of choice came up. And I think for readers, this is going to be the hardest part.
Yeah,
right?
I think so too. Mm-hmm.
It's like this idea that she's nightcrawling, right? And you're thinking as a reader, really? I don't want you out there. I want you inside. Why won't you go inside?
Yeah.
And so this question of choice keeps coming up, and you do it beautifully by having that contrast with her best friend. Her best friend's sister gets kidnapped and
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So talk to us a bit about this notion of choice and how important it was to explore in this book.
I mean, Clara, Ole's sister, was really important. It was an addition later on. I knew that there was going to be controversy around the idea of like what is sex work and what is trafficking, and how can we create distinctions, and are there always distinctions? And for me, it was important that like Kiara doesn't always, like, right and wrong is not the most important thing to her. Right. You know, consent and non-consent is not always the center of her world. And so I knew that I wanted to explore this like idea of trafficking, which is very real in the context of the novel. And I remember even like watching an interview with Celeste Guap, and where she talks about being trafficked. And I know that like there were times in which she didn't explain it that way. And I think that kind of like shifting idea of ourselves is very real. And so this book is set in the present tense. This is Kiara in her in the current moment. Yeah. I don't think that she thinks she's being trafficked. Right. But I also think that like that's part of the challenge of it, is that as the reader, we might believe something about her that she wouldn't agree with. And I think it's interesting to have people with more clear lines, like Ole's sister Clara, who goes missing and is assumed to have been trafficked. But then you have characters like Camila and like Kiara who have intentionally entered sex work and find parts of it really fulfilling and other parts of it not. And we had a sex worker. It was really important to me that a sex worker read this book and provide that feedback too, so that I could tell it in the most accurate way as I could. But I also had to make choices about the character and where her position is because the sex worker that read it, she talked a lot about like the idea of danger and how we think about a profession that very much is valid in itself, but that the world doesn't validate, and because of the criminalization of sex work, it creates these dangers in a profession that like it in itself is not necessarily what makes it hard, as much as the conditions around it that make it nearly impossible to do it in a way that your body isn't at risk.
Isn't at risk, yeah. So this is fascinating because this notion, I absolutely, look, I'm going to say I agree with her assessment of her own book.
You're the lawyer here.
As I was speaking, that didn't come out right. But so I also saw like that. In fact, there were a point at which she's sort of latching, or not even latching onto, but she has this recognition that people are calling what she's doing sex trafficking. Yeah. Right?
Yeah,
the purple suit, you know, who is the woman police officer, detective, or whatever. And it was clear that she had not seen herself in that way. Yet throughout the entire book, she's also grappling with the choice question. Yeah. She says at various sort of haphazardly, she'll say, but did I really have a choice? Or I lost my job, did I really have a choice?
Right.
So for me, it was so interesting that the sort of the fluidity and the complications and the nuance, it's not black or white. It's not binary.
It's not at all.
Like, I think even her own identity, like, I'm doing this, but maybe I shouldn't. And then, she was the shame. She talks about she couldn't even tell.
Yeah.
Was it Trey? Like, she couldn't tell.
Yeah, Tony.
Tony,
yeah.
yes, sorry.
And it's really hard too because she understood the judgments that would come onto her, and when she herself was in a position of this choice made the most sense for me at this time, but was it a choice because I was pushed into a corner in which I had to make it? Right. That's always the question, is like, I mean, choice sometimes is not the most important thing in this scenario, is whether it's a choice or not, because sometimes it has to happen. And I think that for Kiara, she is experiencing this idea of choices as being something that she's just not entitled to in the first place. Right.
There's that sense, right? This sense of who she is always in question. Like her, I hate to use, because it's so, it sort of simplifies it too much, almost her self-worth, what she's entitled to.
And the men in her life give her no ability to make different choices.
Right.
Yeah.
And then so this actually takes me to another place, which is your book really grapples with a number of social justice issues beyond just sex work and sex trafficking, right? And which tie to this notion of Kiara's choice or lack of choice. So, I mean, I think the book explores, obviously, policing violence, but low wage earning, the inadequacy of the child welfare system, which is why she has to take care, or she believes she has to take care of Trevor when his mother, can't take care of him. Unhoused children is at issue, the criminalization of poverty and childhood. And so when you talk about the men in her life don't give her a choice in some ways, also society,
systems don't,
systems don't give her a choice. So say more about what I thought you really nicely zeroed in on one critical social justice issue or social issue, which is the sex trafficking, sex work. But yet you very delicately, without beating us over the head, without lecturing to us, covered each of these other, touched on and made us recognize each of these other social justice issues. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that I try to think about fiction as a story, right? And why do we need stories? Because it allows us to invest in people we might not otherwise have. Yeah. And I think that I wanted to create these characters that we love first. Like, first and foremost, we love them. We want to follow them through their worlds. And because of that, it doesn't allow us to distance ourselves in the ways that I think we often distance ourselves when we're talking about statistics, about politics in a very theoretical way. And so I wanted to create this whole world that is the reverberations of all of these systems are clear in the very personal way that they show up in our lives. And these characters don't care about politics in the traditional sense, but they do experience them and their impact on their bodies and their lives. And so I wanted to make sure that was like at the core of this book, was that, it doesn't really matter what you believe going in. It matters that you care about these people, because then your ideas of the world shift when you love people who are experiencing something that you might not otherwise have thought about in terms of like yourself or someone you love.
Yeah, I think that's another thing. That's really what's so beautiful about the book is I say all the time that when we write, you have to write to change hearts and minds. And what changes hearts and minds is stories. And so that's beautiful, and you can weave together then the policies and
politics
solutions.
are always about people, and I think we forget that often.
Yeah, it's great. Well, you did a beautiful job of that, of invoking empathy. I'm gonna give you these questions too. So talk to us a bit about, so Oprah says, the book is also about hope, right? And I'm one of these people, I'm really terrible. I want every book to end with the world is saved, Clara gets found, or, Ale and Kiara get together. I want it all the time together. Yeah, life doesn't work that way, and a good novel doesn't work that way. But there is still, I did feel like the book ended with some sense of hope. So can you say more about that?
I knew from the beginning I didn't want to end this novel with finding justice or hope in the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
That was never going to be the way that it ended. And so I felt so strongly about that from the beginning. I met with editors and I was like, I'm not changing the ending. Whatever, like if you want this book, you have to be okay with the ending. And they were like, but it's a little grim. And I think that's part of, what the world is it's kind of grim sometimes. But also I think that we can't expect for a system that has never provided us anything to give us hope.
Right.
And so I wanted the shift in this book from the beginning to the end to be in Kiara, to be in the ways that she allows herself to exist, in the ways that she acknowledges her experience instead of finding it externally, because we just don't.
Right, you don't. No spoilers here. So I want to, I'll make them read to find out how it ends. But yeah, I love that. I love that, just the reality of it all. So before we kick it to the audience, I know folks in the audience have questions. I really want to turn back to the writing and you as a poet laureate. And so one, your favorite, not your favorite, but one of your favorite passages, maybe about Oakland. You want to read for us?
Yeah. It's just a paragraph, so it'll be real short. But this is a description of High Street, which is where most of the book is set around. And I grew up right off High Street, so. High Street is an illusion of cigarette butts and liquor stores, a winding trail to and from drugstores and adult playgrounds masquerading as street corners. It has a childlike kind of flair, like the perfect landscape for a scavenger hunt. Nobody ever knows when the hoods switch over, all the way up to the bridge, but I've never been up there, so I can't tell you if it makes you want to skip like it does on our side. It is everything and nothing you'd expect, with its funeral homes and gas stations, the street sprinkled in houses with yellow shining out the windows.
Love it. Look at that beautiful language. Beautiful, beautiful language. The other thing that I found myself doing while I read was just starring all of the beautiful quotes. Kiara talks about Trevor. She says, "The boy is my autumn rain." I was like, oh, that's a poet laureate, right? I think 190, I have to tell you about the numbers in a second. I think 190 might have a moon in place of his heart. 190 is a police officer. She talks about each of the police officers as numbers. So I call it policing by numbers. I just thought it was so fascinating. But I think 190 might have a moon in place of his heart, waxing and waning, trying to decide if it's whole. Wow. Just so beautiful, beautiful, beautiful.